Welcome to Talk OT to Me, the podcast where we get nerdy but stay real about the world of operational technology.
Here we dig into the issues shaping modern manufacturing.
Let's talk OT.
Hi, my name is Jesper Anderson.
And I'm Justin Powell.
And welcome to the podcast where we talk about OT that really matters. So identity, what we've been talking about, this is my topic.
Yeah.
Because it's something I've thought a lot about. It's like, do you separate the ID? Do you separate your AD, your identity provider into two, OT or IT, or do you have them in one, or do you federate them, or how? So this was a topic that I really wanted to discuss. It's something
interesting topic
a lot right now.
Yeah, for sure. And from an identity standpoint, this is the first time we've done this together.
That's right.
So, we have to look each other in the eyes. So
Yes.
it's great to be here in COVID.
Yes. Yeah. Flying home from US.
Yes. So, on the question of identity, the first thing that occurs to me is, we think of it in very technical terms,
Yes.
right? AD and integration and single sign-on, all these different things. But, what I was thinking about as we talked about this is, what is identity? What does that mean? Like if you were to ask a user, how do you verify your identity, or what is your identity? That's very different than if you ask an IT professional. And I think the answer would be very different if you ask an OT professional. Like, what does that word mean even?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. How would you define it?
Well, as a user, if you ask me what my identity is, I'm not going to answer in a technical term. Like, I'm not going to say username, password. I'm not going to say, I'm a mix of credentials. Right. But that's how we want to sort people out. But that doesn't necessarily work with the way a user thinks about themselves. And again, if you ask an IT professional, the answer is very technical. Oh, you are this username, you are this password, you're maybe this multi-factor method. And so I think that's probably where we see maybe resistance is the right word, or maybe even vulnerability introduced into the system, because figuring that out and identifying what are the factors to say this person is who they are. I mean, that's really what we're trying to get to. Yeah. So,
and where do you store those informations, and how do you contain them? But it's a good point. Like, I remember when Zero Trust really started coming out, and especially if you used it internally at sort of, we're having Zero Trust here. Oh, so you don't trust me? You're looking at my identity, but you don't trust me. I'm sitting in the room, but it's for cybersecurity purposes. It's often something else that we think about than when we sit with the users in front of us and talk about it.
Yeah. And I think that friction that's introduced to the system by telling a user, hey, you have to do it this way.
Yeah.
Well, I should back up. I think the friction is caused because IT is looking at it from an efficiency standpoint.
Yes.
Like, how do we fit everybody into one bucket?
Yeah.
With the right little pieces to know, okay, this person is different than this person, that's different than this person. And then from a Zero Trust standpoint, once you put those things together, what does this person have access to? And that's where I think the real crux of the issue is between IT and OT, which I'm getting ahead of ourselves. I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I think once you put it into, you need to put it into the right perspective from the user perspective, but also from IT, OT perspective, because we do think about it differently. Like it is in an IT world, it's about efficiency. 180 makes it very efficient to control it. It's very easy to set it up there. You have it in one place. So from an OT perspective, where also the risk factors are a little bit different between the two of them. So oftentimes you go in and you say to the IT, it's like, and this is what I experienced, then the IT says, oh, it's in my AD and has SSO. Oh, I'm fine from my perspective. Not thinking about how is it set in perspective to the rest, what boundaries are there, OT is different, so how do I deal with that? Oh, it's in my AD and I'm using my SSO. Okay, then I'm all good. But actually, that's the start of your conversation, not the end of your conversation. Yes. Now you've introduced a system into your AD, whether that's an HMI somewhere or a remote access, like for us, for example. But the start of this discussion is just you're in your AD and SSO, but that shouldn't stop that discussion at all, because the needs of the OT from our uptime perspective, also the security impacts, are just different there.
Yeah, I think that's probably something that we should define for the audience, because you and I know this because we live in this world. But on the OT side, identity is important, but there are factors that are more important, like uptime, safety, the ability to control systems or even stop systems. And if you have a single sign-on process that prevents a plant from operating safely, now you've introduced real risk, like physical risk into the system, not just risk from an IT perspective.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And I think I had a customer the other day that we discussed a couple of things with, and one of the things he was very keen on is also understanding the risk from an IT perspective, because you're also introducing vendors into your AD. If you're
Yep.
a lot of OT is done by accessing from internally, because normally you don't have the people on site or you don't have the competencies inside your company. So a lot of those coming into your AD all of a suddenly ends up being, from an OT perspective, external ones coming in that introduce another level of risk there. So it's also for the IT to think about what is the risk coming from the OT side, because you might have plants around the world that doesn't have the security level that you would see in an office. So it's also both ways. You have to think about this going back and forth. And I think back to what Maersk experienced back in the day, there was somebody from the OT coming into the IT, infecting the whole team, costing them billions of dollars. So it is a both ways here.
Yeah, and we just saw last year with Jaguar Land Rover.
Yeah.
So their entire production capability at I think it's 3 factories in Europe, one in somewhere else in Europe, not in the UK, and then one in India. They were taken offline for practically an entire month.
Yeah.
And I just read that it cost them, the estimates are like $3.5 billion dollars or pounds. I don't remember which one it was, euros. And that came the other way, right?
Yeah.
That was an IT breach
Yes.
that ultimately, because they had federated their environment
Yes.
in a what would look like an IT best practices method, that took all of their production down on the OT side. So efficiency is great, but if it's efficiently shutting things down, that's not great.
No, and I think this is also one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this topic. I think it's going to come up more and more.
Mhm.
I also think some of the standards, IS, and also NIS2 here in Europe, insurance company, they got a lot more of this as a point of failure. Like if you have one ID, how are you managing that efficiently? Are you making sure you're secure? Because I think in general, we're going to look at this identity in one place as a linchpin, both in terms of like security, but also in terms of uptime. If your AD is compromised, how are you going to handle this? If your internet connection is called, how are you going to handle your identity on site? You have to start thinking about the next level of these things. Land Rover is a great example. Maersk is also another example where you really need to start not just having the conversation of AD and SSO and you're done with the conversation, but how do you set up your AD SSO, because it's such a linchpin. If a hacker gets in there, understands the network, understands how it is, it might be they might come in and understand, oh, if I'm targeting that HR, I can give access into your whole OT environment, because that's the one I can then add the. So you have to understand what comes afterwards, because the impact of this being a linchpin, especially if you have all in one, is huge. Also,
right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, at least in what I've read. You take like NIST 882, which is a OT specific special application, where they recommend, at least the way I read the standard, they recommend having completely separate AD infrastructure or identity infrastructure is probably a better way to say it. And again, the older standard, relatively speaking, it's out for comments now for an updated version. So that's a few years old. But the reality of the world we live in is we see customers that are trying to figure that out of how do I control access and allow access, but do it in a way that has some sort of regulatory compliance auditability to it.
Yes. Yeah. And in some sense, like the easy answer for the auditability is like, if you put it in one place, we have it in one site, we can audit it easily there. And that is also the correct answer. But I think from an audit perspective, there's going to be a discussion around, for example, like NIS2 doesn't go as far as that yet. But in there, you need to make sure you understand your points of failure and how do you manage those. So at least you need to make the decision of what you're doing. I think that's really what is coming down to, is that the standards are being reevaluated from a compliance perspective. But I do think that what I see is that you have to make a decision. You cannot longer just say, hey, I have this covered, both from NIS2, but also you need to be sure to take the next step.
So that brings up an interesting question. Who makes that decision? And we see that friction, right? Because I have a very large customer that is a customer of ours because OT, the OT management said, we're not letting IT manage our access control or our users, because it wasn't fast enough, it wasn't agile enough. There were all sorts of reasons why they said, no, we're not going to do it your way. So what do you think about that? How do you see that playing out?
I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation, because in one sense, I always think about it like, who's the actual users of like when you talk OT specifically, it's about uptime at the end of the day. And you need to make sure that the ones that are sitting with the uptime that has the responsibility also gains a big part of the control. So I do think it sits with the OT cybersecurity to make an assessment for their environment. I think you need to look at it like from a top down and see the full perspective strategy from a CISO perspective. But I do think you need to make sure you separate the two, because their requirements are too different. I think this is why we see these very, like us as specific vendors for OT, is that there's just too big a bridge to gap. So you need to make sure you understand your requirements, your risk in your OT, and then let that bubble up. And then you get IT involved, IT cybersecurity involved, to see where can we fit it in. And I think OT needs a point of view on it other than just, hey, the speed of getting them in, and also the uptime needs to be, but they also need it from a security perspective, because the overlap between the lateral movement between the two environments, for a lot of them, is just too big today.
That's a great. Some of the best practices that I was reading about when you talk about federation or the combination of these two environments, convergence of IT and OT, is they talked about, obviously, if you just have a completely flat approach, you've just doubled the attack surface, right? You just have said, hey, let's welcome everybody to attack everything. And so some of the recommendations, if you go down that road, are, okay, well, now you need to have complete network segmentation, both obviously on the IT side, which is fairly common, but on the OT side as well. And that's not as common. I've run into lots of customers that have very flat factory networks that everything's on the same subnet. You can get access however you want to get access to it. Obviously, that's going to be a problem in an environment where you're combining all your identity management for IT and OT into one system.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's going to be the point of thing that they're going to have to talk about. I also think pen testing here, like not in the sense that, but like maybe a purple team pen testing. Mm-hmm. When we do pen testing, I think or at least from our recommendation, is that you have to look past on the system you're pen testing, and you have to log into your AD also and say, because predominantly the chances are that your attack is going to come from the identity side. The vast majority of your attacks that's going to come in, it's going to come through or have to take a step through your identity management. So you have to take that piece in to really understand how am I set up? Because a lot of the times we see, I have a flat network, and then if it's an external one, hey, I have a SSO, but I also have some sort of request for access, making sure somebody on. But then you take an internal employee, which is where the likelihood of the attack is going to come from. Oh, I have a flat network, and I also have a fairly flat structure in my AD. For example, I have one account for my IT admins that can give rights to everybody.
Right.
If you compromise, then you have compromised the whole damn thing with one sort of attack vector. So you also need to make sure, like, for example, are you also segmenting the credentials in your ID, in your AD that can handle administrator from IT? Shouldn't necessarily be the same on your OT. You need to have start to build out some sort of separation. Again, like we talked about HR. Is HR capable of adding everybody to every group there? Or is there some sort of approval process internally to start stopping that? How do you make sure that spillover effect doesn't come in there? Starting to see pen tests now, especially Purple Team, taking that approach, looking into AD, and the vast majority of the findings that come out of that is on the AD side of things. And some of the things I've seen, there are some pretty big surprises in there, where this is where your majority of your risk actually stems from. So do you think this is something we're going to see a lot?
So great point, which is scary to begin with. Now I'm going to make it even more scary. So every cybersecurity professional knows this, that the human is the weakest link in our security chain, right? That's just the reality of life. The vast majority of corporate IT cybersecurity attacks start with phishing, right? You have to do phishing training. Like it's a joke that people are like, oh yeah, I've got to do this training, whatever. Not a joke that it's not important, but everybody's just aware that that's a mechanism that a lot of attacks start through. In addition to phishing, and I didn't make up these acronyms, but you also have vishing, which is voice phishing. I worked for a company that provided some training services around that. And we actually vished the company, and we had an 80% success rate of people actually giving out their own credentials to somebody on the phone pretending to be from their IT team. Now, add in this whole idea of AI deepfake, and now you can not to try to give the bad guys any ideas. I'm sure they already thought of this, but now you can weaponize that at a gigantic scale. Now, take all that and say, now let's throw that threat to our OT systems. Right? Because that's really, if you're not careful, that's what you're doing.
And then I have a lot of discussions with clients of ours where we're saying, when it's internal, we give them access to everything, and that's where this one becomes really, because like if it's external, we try to put more zero trust in it, but we really need to think about, okay, how do we layer this more in terms of before you get to the really nasty things about OT, where you can really hurt somebody or really take the company down. So I think like this segmentation part of it, like how do you structure your AD, should be thought about, hey, this is the risk that you're facing. Like what you just laid out is the new reality we are in. If you then treat your employees without the proper, and this go back to your identity part where you're saying like, who are we as a person? Like, you don't trust your internal employees. In a sense that it's not that we don't trust you. We just know that the statistics says that you're gonna make a mistake.
Somebody somewhere. Might not be you, but it might be the guy beside you or the girl beside you.
So it's not because we don't trust you or we don't trust IT. It's just that the statistic tells us the chance of this happening and the chance of this being even more complicated to handle in the future is going to be a lot higher. So you really have to start thinking about layering this, whether that's in one or two ADs or it's one, but being very carefully designed. I think it's a very, very important topic for them because it starts to get really scary now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. For sure.
And I don't think whether you have an opinion on whether it's one or the other, whether they should pick or federate, or I think from my perspective, which is a lot about, like I sit with our solution design people, our customer success, our professional service implementation. So it's a lot about what can you actually get done. From my perspective, it is, you need to think this out. You need to understand the risk. You need to think this through. What is it that you want to do? You need to make sure you test it. So you do bubble team internally or externally. And then what is the right solution for me? And this is where I want to hear your perspective on it. Is for me, the right solution is, what can the organization handle?
That's exactly right.
Because if you have two ADs, it's a massive job. If you federate, it's also a massive job, but you have to figure out what can you actually do. Because at the end of the day, I always keep coming back to, especially OT, is like the art of, this is what we want and we want to go here, but our systems, our resources, our cost structure doesn't allow. What level does it allow to get us to? It has to be a practical approach. Yes, the right well is probably that you separate them out, but the cost of managing that would be astronomical or could be big depending on what kind of system you are. So always my sort of where I come to is, you have to figure out what works for you. And for the majority of them, it's probably having it in one and then making sure you do the testing, you actually deliver, you actually check through this, you actually federate it the proper way, you have to control, and that you also, for example, for remote access, add that somebody is stepping in, approving. It's not just your SSO that is proving you're getting in. It's also now your microsegmentation, making sure you can't just access everything. Second part is you make sure you request for access before you go in. Somebody else is approving you before you go in there.
I think you're right. A lot of it comes down to what can you do? But I think, and I've said a lot of things about how IT introduced risks to the OT systems, but I have to be honest as well. There are a lot of OT systems or OT sides of operations that aren't very mature, right? Particularly when it comes to identity.
Yeah.
I talked to a customer who, I won't get into the details, but they realized that an employee that had left 2 years ago still had an account on a particular critical system, which obviously is not great, not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. But because they didn't have, on the OT side, they didn't have a mature identity management process, that, there is some value to having the IT side involved to help them along. But I think it really does come down to, where are you in this process and what can you do, right? I think we've talked about this on a previous podcast, but if you still believe your systems are all air gapped, but you think they're air gapped through a firewall, which again is my pet peeve when somebody says that, you've introduced risk to the system. So totally understand, the complexities that are faced here. But what's your recommendation today? Is single AD, multiple ADs,
That's a
IT specific, OT specific?
very good question that I thought a lot about. Like, I think on top of it is like, if you have the resources to handle it, two ID identity, one for IT, one for OT, is probably completely separated. Also, because the requirements are so different, you often have in the OT there'll be a lot less impact. Oftentimes you see the people that are actually accessing OT environments, it's maybe 1,000 people out of a 10,000 company. So like your factor there goes down a lot with like what is actually possible to take over. So I think if I had the resources, I would separate it. I do think that a lot of companies do not have the resources to actually do that, or for that matter, the maturity to then maintain the two, because then you really need to maintain the two setups. So my first recommendation would be, if you have it, you need to separate it out, because it lowers your attack vector. It allows you to set specific things up for you there. So if you have, but if you do not have the capabilities, think it through as least federated as you possibly can, meaning don't have too many overlap, separates the team, separates access policies, separate admin rights, for example. So you can't have the same admin right. IT, you have a separate admin rights for OT. Make sure you have that locked down and only share what actually must be shared.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times it's just, once you go in there, it just takes 10 seconds to add this admin account to be able to admin these groups. Share only what you really need to share, and you need to lock down those OT admin accounts. And especially if you have a flat network, if you're letting your internal people just access whatever, then you really have to start. So as much sort of segmentation you can between the two, and as deep a segmentation on users and admin levels. Like, there's no reason in a big company that an admin right has the right to add users to all sites, or for that matter, all subnets, if you can swing it, if you have that kind of maturity, or that all users have access to all networks around the world. Like, you're a user, you have a specific, I'm working in this section of the factory, this is what I have access to. So you can't do the two. Get as deep as possible in your segmentation of it and separate it as much. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's good. And I'll add a couple things to that as well. Excuse me. In that environment where you've federated everything, there are some additional controls or best practices that you should have in place. If you can't have a completely separate system, simple things like network monitoring on the OT side of the network, you need to be able to see what's happening.
Yeah.
That's a best practice that 82 recommends. But then also, I thought this was an interesting idea. The experts in this space also recommend, particularly in OT systems, to not use your typical MFA multi-factor authentication corporate process, which is normally on a phone or something like that. And they recommend passkeys or hardware-based keys for critical infrastructure, because then you can't replicate that device right today. Eventually, somebody I'm sure will break it. At the moment. And so then you can prove identity at a higher level for those systems that are critical. And if you have a separate system, obviously you can have different MFA process. And there was one other thing that is recommended, is that you've got to have, in this environment where we're federating or connecting and converging these systems together, got to have the appropriate audit ability on the OT side. And I know that's something that's near and dear to us as part of our products, because that is so important to figure out if, again, you look at these large breaches. I'll use another example, the Colonial Pipeline, which everybody's heard about that. That's been around forever. When they got hit with ransomware, they didn't know whether the ransomware was on their OT side or not. So they shut down operations to begin with. And then they realized, we can't bill for anything because we can't track what's happening on these systems. And so the reason I say all that is if you have an audit trail, if you have visibility, that allows you to create a specific OT disaster recovery plan or instant recovery plan, which again, you're trying to limit the blast radius.
Yeah.
If something bad happens, let's not have it be this big, let's have it be this big.
Yeah.
And so I think if you do federate, then you do have to think about these other controls in addition to segmentation.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a very good point. Is like, because in the discussion, there should never be a separate discussion about AD being your only access point. Like, for example, like we build a lot of what are sometimes called security chains for external vendors into OT systems, and there you would never allow the things that you allowed with an internal user.
Right.
So sometimes we see, okay, we build a very, very elaborate security chain for external users going into the OT. And then when you come to them and ask, what about internal? Well, we use AD and then we have a VPN and then you have access to everything. Then you're making your AD your linchpin. But what happens after that? If you then also go in, and it's the same, especially like if you're looking at the ISO 24702, probably saying the last digits wrong because I always get those mixed up.
But there's 0 and no 1.
Yeah, that's 0 and no. It's 27002 something. But if you go into those standards, what it's also saying is like, you are not allowed just to have open access to people in your, and sometimes I think also because it comes a little bit more from the IT side, is if you had an internal users accessing a server, which is PLCs sometimes should be thought about like with more security as a server, you would never just give that internal person access to work on that server forever. You would say you have a just in time, just as needed access. You would always say that. But when we go to the OT side, which is often more impactful than a server room in an office somewhere, you then give that PLC access like it was just any other PC around there, where that one is actually more critical than your server. But on the server side, you would never allow the kind of access that you give to it. You would say, of course, you need the AD, but it's just in time, just as needed access. And you would audit that thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're not doing that with internal people. So then we're making the AD such a huge linchpin in the OT space. That's really dangerous.
It is. I have an interesting story. I have to be careful because I can't say who it is. We got a call. It's now a customer. It was not a customer when they first called us. This is maybe 5 months ago. And it was from the OT side of the house. And they said, okay, and just so people know, one of our products is secure remote access to these sort of systems. So they were talking to us about secure remote access, of course. And we're like, okay, what's going on? Why are you reaching out with? And they're like, well, we usually use VPN access to get to our factories. Okay, tell me about that. Like, explain that to me. It explains VPN. Long story short, flat access, open to not only employees, third parties. It was the only way they did any maintenance in their systems. And IT called them and said, we're turning it off now, and turned it off. That's the day they got a hold of us. And I don't know the background of who talked to who and sales, all that stuff. I was on the technical side. And within 2 months, they purchased our solution because they didn't have any other requirements. But it was an interesting, I don't know the right. Normally, you don't see IT act that aggressively. Yeah. But in that case, it was probably the right move. Yeah. Yeah. Now, it probably could have transitioned it a little bit more smoothly because I know that the OT side of the house was not very happy because they lost remote access to all of the factories. They had to start flying people in for months, which isn't ideal. Yeah. I think they had 7 locations, so it wasn't the end of the world. But that became an opportunity for us. But to your point about, when you do give this flat access, if it's on the on the IT side, bad things can happen. They could get access to files they shouldn't get access to. They could publish material that would make the company look bad, internal stuff, whatever. But on the OT side, again, I just like to reiterate this for people who aren't as familiar with that side. You're talking about life and safety issues. I was just reading an article, and I don't remember the name of the dam, but it's a dam in Norway that, according to this article, and I don't know, I've only read one source on it. It was apparently hacked by Russian hackers, or they say it allegedly was. They were able to open the sluice way, whatever you call it, that allowed, it was something like, I don't know how many hundreds of or tens of thousands of gallons that were released for this dam for 4 hours before anybody even noticed. Now, does that sound like a big deal? Well, in this case, it wasn't. The lake level was high enough that it could release. And more importantly, they weren't at any sort of flood stage downstream. But had that happened a different time of year or, whatever, suddenly you're talking about flooding towns, all because somebody got access to a system they shouldn't get access to, maliciously in this case. It was a state actor. But those are the types of events that can happen if we don't think through, to your point, you don't go, okay, I want easy access. I want good user management. I want these things. Okay, those are all great. But what's no pun intended, what's the downstream effect of allowing that type of access?
Exactly. And I do think this is why this is such a big topic, is like that the impact. This is also why you and me love talking about this and work in this space. It's like that.
Yeah, and it's great to do it face to face. It's so much not over a video screen.
But that is because like we are talking about real thing, and the IT impact is also there. But like the systems that we protect, the people we talk to on a day-to-day basis, all the unsung heroes out there that notice something like that make sure the system is secure. Those are the people that and the things that we really love collaborating on here. So
well, we're the weirdos. Like, I'm sitting in this room and I can see a crane operating over there that's unloading cargo containers, and all I think about is, I wonder how that's secured. Everything is written. So that's maybe not good, but
very close at the port of Copenhagen here, where we are recording at our offices. So we can see just outside the port of Copenhagen, out here with some big cranes moving containers. Exactly. Okay, let's wrap it up. I think this was so nice seeing you in person.
I know. Maybe we'll do it again this week. While I'm in town.
So thank you so much for listening to this. Reach out to us if you have any questions or follow up. We are happy to help here. So thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, and let me add one thing as well. For anybody watching this, if you have comments on something that we didn't touch on, or maybe something you disagree with, feel free to leave it in the comments. We'll be glad to interact on that. And we don't know everything. We know a lot. We have opinions, but we'd love to hear your opinions too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to Talk OT to Me.